Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in with us. My name is Nancy Fortunato, and I'm the senior panel leader at Rise Magazine. Today with me is Lynn Lane from Brooklyn Defenders. We are going to be talking about the difference between neglect and abuse. One comment before I begin. This presentation is focused on New York State laws and policies. Remember that child welfare rules are slightly different state by state.
Before I explain the difference between abuse and neglect, I want to make an important point, which is that the vast majority of cases against parents are for neglect and not for abuse. Only a small fraction of cases are actually filed as abuse cases. In New York State, only about 5% of cases that go to court are for abuse. It's very uncommon. The definition of abuse is pretty clear. Sexually abusing your children or severely injuring them can be considered abuse. But again, it's very uncommon to see these cases in family court. Neglect is much more complicated because the definition is much broader. When someone thinks of the word neglect, they typically think of an image of an unloved child who doesn't have parents to care about them or to really take care of them. But that's not how neglect is defined under the law. Under the law, neglect doesn't mean you're a bad parent, and it doesn't mean that you don't love your child. What it refers to is an action or an inaction by a parent or a caregiver that, for example, fails to provide for your child or you fail to supervise your child. Failing to provide can mean a number of things. It could mean missing doctor's appointments. It could mean not having sufficient food or clothing. It could also even mean not getting your child to school regularly and on time. A failure to supervise could mean fighting with your partner in front of your child or drinking and using drugs to the point of intoxication. Nancy's going to talk about how poverty and cultural differences are critical in when a parent is prosecuted for neglect. It's not fair, but it's something that we see frequently in family court.
Absolutely. It's impossible to talk about neglect without talking about poverty. They go hand in hand. When parents are struggling financially, there may be basic gaps in care for their children. If you don't have enough money for childcare or transportation, it can be hard to go to that doctor's appointment or that teacher conference. Furthermore, Black and brown and immigrants families may be held to a different standard than white privileged families. A privileged parent may smoke marijuana and drink that beer and not be judged for it. They also have the means to pay for childcare, which would allow them to go out and party or drink. But parents living in poverty may not have those same options. In New York City, child welfare cases mostly frequently happens in the 8 neighborhoods. They are low-income neighborhoods of color. 53% of Black children in New York City will experience a child abuse investigation at some point in their lives. A national study found that children of color, especially Black children, are more likely to be put in foster care than receive in-home services, even when their family have the same problem as a white family.
Neglect is made even more complicated because it's not only defined as harming your child, but also as putting your child at risk of harm. For example, if you're a young single parent living in the shelter system and you leave your child or children home alone to take out the garbage, to do laundry, or even for a longer period of time, that can be considered neglect because you're putting your child at risk of harm. Even if nothing bad actually happens to your child. It's just about that risk. For this reason, many common family activities can unfortunately result in neglect cases. As an attorney, part of my job is to show the judge that parents did not put their children at risk of harm, and actually what's frequently alleged as neglect is really just a parent or families living in poverty and experiencing the challenges of living in poverty.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Now, domestic violence is a good example of a confusing reason for neglect. Being a victim of domestic violence, it is not neglect, and it isn't your fault. But you have a legal obligation to protect your children from risk of harm. If you stay in a relationship that you know that is violent, you are exposing your children to possible violence. That may be neglect under the law. In most DV relationships, the person who's causing harm is the one that's providing for the family. And for many reasons we know, it can be hard to separate. However, I do encourage you, if you know that you are in a very bad situation like this, try to leave when it's safe to do so. Our advice for parents is, if you argue with your partner, do not do it in front of the children. However, we know that is also not realistic. Sometimes it does happen. If you're taking an order of protection against someone, do not contact them. Please don't contact them. This is failed to enforce an order and could be considered neglect. However, if you choose to do it, do not do it in front of your children.
Another confusing reason for neglect is mental illness. I want to be clear, having a diagnosis alone is not neglect and it's not your fault. But you do have an obligation to supervise your children in a safe way. So for example, if you don't take care of yourself and your illness by not going to therapy or taking medication as recommended by a doctor, you could be putting your child at risk of harm, and that could be considered neglect. Our advice for parents is, first, don't sign any release forms for anyone to access your mental health treatment. This is commonly known as a HIPAA release form, and if you're going to sign any forms, do your best to speak to a lawyer or an advocate first, and never sign a blank release form. If you've ever had a mental health evaluation, try to get a copy of it and know it. Be the expert in your own mental health. If you believe your diagnosis is wrong or out of date, get a new evaluation, and make sure this evaluation reflects where you are and how you're functioning now. And finally, if you choose to stop taking your medication, make sure that you have a doctor's note that says that you can stop taking your medication.
Again, never sign a blank HIPAA form. Now we'll take some questions from our Facebook viewers. Some of these questions was already sent to us in advance, and we wrote them down, and we will answer them to the best of our ability. So, Liz, one question is, what is the most common abuse and neglect cases you have seen in family court?
So I want to reiterate again that we frequently see mostly neglect cases in court. Abuse cases are much more rare and much more complicated, legally speaking. But a frequent neglect case that we see is actually one involving allegations of excessive corporal punishment. And I do want to say that corporal punishment, when reasonable, is permitted here in New York. The question of when something becomes excessive can depend on a lot of things. It can depend on the age of the child, the circumstances involving the corporal punishment, whether an object was used. Generally speaking, using a belt, for example, to hit your child is not a good idea and will be considered neglect, even if there's no mark or bruise on a child. Other common cases that we see are domestic violence cases, cases involving drug use, and we also see some home alone cases where parents are accused of putting their child at risk of harm because they've left that child home alone.
Absolutely. And even, isn't it like if I could leave a child that's maybe 13 years old, depending on his or her ability to supervise herself at a short period of time, would that be considered neglect as well?
It could be considered neglect. So there is no age at which the law says a child can be left home alone and it won't be considered neglect. But I think you're right, Nancy. It depends on a lot of different factors. Courts will typically, and the judge will typically look at the age of the child, the functioning of that child, and what, if any, safety plans a parent put in place for a child who is home alone. So for example, you might have a very mature 8-year-old who is able to recite phone numbers, a plan, versus a 14-year-old who perhaps isn't quite as capable. And again, all of these things depend on the specific facts of every situation.
Absolutely. The next question is smoking marijuana in front of your children is considered neglect?
So the answer to that in New York, at least, is yes, it can be. I think this is an important topic that goes back to what, Nancy, you were talking about earlier, and how parents who are low income and parents of color and their actions are viewed differently than white or privileged families. And so the answer is that marijuana and smoking marijuana around your children can definitely be considered neglect. And the question is really about how frequently a parent uses marijuana, to what extent and how it all, if anything, impairs your ability to parent.
Yes, but we also know that most of the parents, especially parents that are struggling financially, they are using marijuana to self-medicate themselves so they could be able to be there and for their children and do what's needed for them to do. Would that still be considered neglect?
So unfortunately, yes, I think it can be. And again, I think you're right. Many parents of all different backgrounds may use marijuana for those types of reasons. Unfortunately, that can be considered neglect. I would certainly say that if you are using marijuana and you find yourself in a situation where you have an ACS case, and if you have a lawyer, make sure you talk to your lawyer about what you're doing and what your options could possibly be.
Would that also mean the parents that are more privileged, that do smoke the marijuana, why is okay for them to do it and not okay for parents that are poor and living in poverty and low income communities with basically not enough resources? Why is that?
So I don't know the answer to why that is, but I think you're pointing out definitely something that we see a lot, which is that the actions of low income and poor parents are viewed differently at many times. And a parent who has a larger apartment, lives in a more affluent neighborhood, might be engaging in the same activities as low-income parents, but unfortunately are not being held to the same standards.
So true. The next question, what is the biggest myth about child abuse and neglect?
I think the biggest myth is that any single parent or any family that is involved with the child welfare system is there because the parent definitely did something bad to their child. Like I said earlier, we see a lot, and most of the cases that we see are neglect cases. And so that could be putting your child at risk of harm for things that many parents do. And I think there's a misunderstanding that you can only be involved in the child welfare system if you've actually done something really terrible. When in reality, I think a lot of it has to do with poverty and racism.
Absolutely. I also believe that is, parents learn how to parent their child because of the way they were taught from their parents and their grandparents. And sometimes even culture plays a big part of parenting, and that sometimes can be used against them because people do not understand their culture and use that they're being abusive or neglectful, when in reality, this is part of their culture. They've been doing this for a long period of time, or this is the way mom raised me, and this is how I'm going to raise my daughter or my son. And what they should do about in those circumstances like that.
I think that's a really good point, is that parenting and being a part of a family means something different to everyone. And I think it's important for you to be able to maintain your cultural values while safely parenting. And I think to the extent, if you find yourself involved with ACS and you feel that what you're being accused of has something to do with perhaps your culture or how you were raised, and if you have a lawyer, communicate that to your lawyer and talk to them, and try to understand and empower yourself on how to maintain those cultural values while also safely parenting.
Absolutely. The last question, does all child welfare investigation end up in court cases?
No, so there are actually quite a number of cases that will stay within the investigation period, which I know that Nancy, you're going to speak with another attorney later this afternoon about. But lots of parents can actually have investigations and never be brought to family court because either the investigation closes and they don't find a reason to be bringing parents to family court, or perhaps even parents are offered services, and when a parent agrees to do those services, they may not choose to bring a family to court.
Just want to say hello, Nicole. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
For watching us. One more question before we close out. What should I do to learn if I'm being investigated by child services for neglect and abuse?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say is that investigations can be really scary, and they can be extremely stressful. So I know this might be hard, but try your best to stay calm in those situations, because when you're being investigated, everything that you say and everything you do is being taken down, it's being recorded in notes. So it's important to stay calm and trust yourself. You are an expert in your own children. You are a parent. You have the power to make certain decisions. That being said, at least in New York, you're not entitled to an attorney during the investigation period, and I don't think that you're entitled to attorneys during the investigation period in any state. Some states, and New York is one of them, you are entitled to a lawyer if you're brought to family court. So if you have a lawyer or you have access to a lawyer, my first piece of advice is to talk to a lawyer. What do you think, Nancy?
I believe stick to the allegations. Don't start going talking off the cuff and tell them about something else that got nothing to do with the investigation. I also want to say, educate yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Educate yourself. Go to our website, Rise Magazine. We have a wealth of information about investigation, about tips on visiting, about service plan, about, well, so much. There is so much. If you want to educate yourself, this would be a good time to go on the website, look through our magazines, read it. There's a whole bunch of resources and information, and you can also reach out to Office of Advocacy and even talk to a lawyer just to find what can you do in that situation, and someone who can help you to guide you in the right direction. Well, this is the end of our video. Thank you for coming out. I know that was a lot of information, and I encourage you to revisit the video, take some notes, and use that as a tool to empower yourself and advocate for yourself. So we'll be back for part 2 in the evening. Be safe and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.